All right, if I had to hazard a guess, I would guess that most of you weren't alive or don't remember the 60s. And it's often said that even if you were alive during the 60s, you probably don't remember it. So, the important thing about the 1960s is that this decade was so full of chaos and things going around in the world. And like us today, the youth of that time played a vital role in the efforts and movements like never before. And because of the newfound media, like newspapers and TV coverage, people were able to take in more information than ever before, and everything was so much more public. So the things they went through were on display like their parents they could not understand. So the first part of the 60s that I want to talk about youth involvement is the civil rights movement. So, in the early 60s, 1960 to be exact, in Nashville, Tennessee, a group of students got together and formed what's called the Nashville Student Movement, which organized what we now know as the sit-ins in Nashville. So a group of students would go sit in a diner in Nashville, and this was in order to protest segregation of restaurants. So they would go in multiracial groups and sit together even though it was illegal and try to get the people to serve them. So this caused a lot of controversy, obviously, and it was complemented by Martin Luther King himself. The next piece of the civil rights movement that the youth was involved in were the Freedom Rides. So this was also a group of young people who were trying to protest the segregation on buses. So they got in multiracial groups again and rode Greyhound buses southward across the country. This was supposed to be a form of peaceful protest. However, when they reached Alabama, they were pulled out of the bus and then beaten severely. The bus was set on fire. And after that, the Nashville student movement picked up the cause of Freedom Rides and still kept going. So then that was youth supporting youths. Finally, another event in the civil rights movement that was spearheaded by the youth. In 1963 in Birmingham, they had a children's crusade. It was organized by James Bevel. So this is how they gathered students of Birmingham, and this is children ranging from the ages of like 6 to 18. It's children of all ages to march in Birmingham to protest segregation in schools. It was on May 2nd of 1963. And on this day is when it started, and over 20 children were arrested and taken to jail. The protest continued for a few days, and it only continued to get more violent to the point where there was hoses and the threats of dogs being used against children protesting for the right to go to school. And finally, about the civil rights movement, to comment on the pure chaos. In the span of the 1960s, there were 3 assassinations that I just find very important to like the youth movement because they were such big leaders in these movements such as civil rights and feminism and other things. So the first assassination in the 60s was obviously JFK. He was shot in Dallas in November, on November 22nd. Following that, Martin Luther King Jr. was also shot in Memphis in 1968, and then a month following him, Robert Kennedy was also shot in 1968 on May 6th. And these were all people that were leading the civil rights movement. Robert Kennedy had just won the primaries in California and South Dakota, I believe. So he was looking into being the next Democratic candidate, but he was shot before he could actually get into office, and Richard Nixon was elected. So in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed following all of these protests, and this outlawed public segregation. So you could say that they had achieved their goal. And the second part of the Civil Rights Act that I want to talk about that goes into the next part, the next movement that the young generation was involved in was the second wave of feminism. So the Civil Rights Act included Title IX, which said that you, in getting a job or anything, you could not discriminate on the basis of sex. And this was in anything that was federally funded. So this meant that girls, that colleges had to follow it too, and schools. So this led to girls finally learning to play sports. So it questioned the idea of like dainty femininity. And then finally, in the early 1960s, birth control became approved and widely available, and by 1963, there were 2.3 million women on birth control. So it became immensely popular, and this was controversial because it was mostly young, unmarried women who were choosing to use birth control because they wanted to have sex and not have babies. So this was controversial because, like, for the first time in history, women had the power to decide when they had kids. And it was spearheaded by girls entering college who decided that maybe they didn't want to live the traditional lifestyle. Next, after protests, JFK signed the Equal Pay Act passed in 1963. And this just kind of bothered me because 55 years ago, JFK signed the Equal Pay Act, and there are still women today fighting for equal pay, so the problems of this decade are still very prominent. In the mid-60s, the National Organization of Women was founded by Betty Friedan, and they championed the Equal Rights Amendment as well. Then finally, the last piece in Griswold versus Connecticut, women were finally allowed, in Griswold versus Connecticut, it was finally accepted that married couples could get contraceptives, because before that, if you were married, then you could not use contraception. Okay. So the second wave of feminism kind of took up the middle of the 60s. And then we kind of get to the end of the 60s and Vietnam is occurring. So in 1969, Richard Nixon implemented a new draft system in which it was a lottery. So if you were born on a certain day, they would draw it out, and it was in a televised ceremony. So this is a picture of the ceremony in which they picked it out of the I can't think of the word for it, impendent, and that's how you knew you got drafted. So if you saw this on TV, and you got drafted, you were going to war. This obviously had a lot of kickback, especially, for example, in the case of Muhammad Ali, who got convicted for evading the draft because he said that he did not want, it was against his religion, and it was against his religious reasons to go. So he got convicted and he got out on bail, but he also lost all the boxing titles that he had had. He was stripped of them. Okay. Then finally, after all of this was very publicized, began the more aggressive, pertinent anti-war movements. So people began to protest, and they were anti-war, make love, not war. And we really started to question, like, why are we in Vietnam? And you could say the turning point was on CBS Evening News after the Tet Offensive, which was an attack on U.S. forces during a ceasefire for their Lunar Year holiday, and it caused heavy casualties, and it was very publicized that, like, it was a battle that we had lost, and on national TV, Walter Cronkite questioned what we were doing in Vietnam and if it was a winnable war. So, finally, after all of this happens, so I believe that, like, the chaos kind of drove the youth to finding new ways to cope and exist in a world that was so overstimulating to them that they didn't understand. So much was happening. So how do you deal with all these things coming at you? And especially since mainstream music is picking up, rock and roll is being, like, developed. So they're finding the rebellion in drugs and music. So In 1967, they had what's called the Summer of Love, where a huge number of people from across the nation, young people, flocked to San Francisco in a neighborhood called Haight-Ashbury, and they all kind of formed like a hippie community there. There was the Diggers, which was a theater group which provided food and medical assistance to people for free, and the idea was kind of like they brought in this idea that they didn't want to use outside money. They wanted to have a society where people didn't own property, so they kind of tried to like make that community there. And while the Summer of Love is like remembered fondly by most, it ultimately like led to worse things. So around this same time, LSD is just being researched by a man named Timothy Leary, who is a psychologist at Harvard who studied the impact of psychology on the brains of college children. So after he did this study, he got fired from Harvard and then decided to go on this like nationwide campaign to promote the use of LSD. So he went on a mythic bus journey where he decorated this whole bus and drove across the country and was like, listen, look at me, I'm doing LSD, and like introduced people to like what this lifestyle was like. So LSD began to pick up, and then by about 66, Ken Casey, who is an upper class businessman, started what was called the acid test. So he went on a national tour where he would rent out big rooms, and he would have a band play and then a jug of Kool-Aid, and it would have acid in it. So it was just a way to experiment and like show people what acid was, and it was like a big group trip. And funny enough, the band that played at the acid test is now known today as the Grateful Dead. So that's where they got their start. That LSD generally is thought to be like the hippie drug of choice, and also thought to be what might be their downfall. Finally, okay, so I skipped this. This is a digger dollar, which was like what they used as like, well, they didn't use it. It was just a symbol of how they did not use regular monetary things. Finally, the late 60s, we had the invention of what we know today as the music festival. So the first music festival that's worth mentioning is the Monterey Pop Music Festival, which happened in California. It was organized by the Mamas and the Papas. This was the first time Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin actually played in a public setting. Finally, what we all know today as Woodstock happened in 1969. It's important to mention that these events were surrounded with bad press because they were like, it caused a traffic jam, there was overcrowding, there was mud because it rained, but what's forgotten to mention is that there were no arrests and no assaults and no charges filed at any of these events, and it was a largely peaceful event. And that's what the press does not like to remember about it. So, in conclusion, there's a generation of the 1960s get a lot of flack for being lazy or being hippies or whatever, and I feel like it has striking similarities to how people refer to millennials. So I think it's just important to remember as millennials that we're not the first generation that's gone through this. Like, we're not the first ones to get hated on.
Good. Okay, who's got a question for you?